Imagine a small city-state where life was dedicated to only one thing: war. Here, children were trained to become warriors from the moment they were born. Their motto was clear: come back with your shield or on it. This was Sparta, the most ruthless warrior society the world had ever seen. But was Sparta truly a land of heroes, or a living nightmare where people were forced to survive in the name of strength?
When we speak of Sparta, the mind often jumps to images of warriors in bronze helmets, red cloaks flowing, and spears raised in defiance. Yet, before Sparta became the most famous military state of ancient Greece, it began as a small settlement in the Peloponnesus, a region in southern Greece that would eventually become the stage for some of history's most legendary struggles. The story of Sparta's birth is as much about geography and migrations as it is about a people who forged a society unlike any other. The land of Sparta, a natural fortress. Sparta was located in the region of Laconia, in the southeastern part of the Peloponnesus Peninsula. Unlike other Greek city-states, Sparta was not built on a hill or coastal harbor. Instead, it lay in a fertile valley along the Eurotas River, surrounded by natural defenses, the rugged Taygetus Mountains to the west and the Parnon Mountains to the east. This isolation gave Sparta a unique advantage. It was difficult for outside forces to invade, and the land itself provided ample farmland, something rare in the mountainous terrain of Greece. While Athens relied on trade and its port at Piraeus, Sparta was largely landlocked. This difference would shape their destinies. Athens looked outward to the sea, becoming a naval power and a hub of trade and ideas. Sparta, on the other hand, turned inward, building a society rooted in agriculture, self-reliance, and, above all, military discipline. The arrival of the Dorians. The origins of Sparta are tied to one of the great migrations in Greek history, the Dorian invasion. Around the 12th century BCE, after the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization, waves of Greek-speaking tribes known as the Dorians swept into southern Greece. Their arrival transformed the political and cultural landscape of the Peloponnesus. According to legend, the Dorians claimed descent from Heracles, or Hercules, and their conquest of Laconia was seen as the fulfillment of a divine right to rule. They established settlements throughout the region, eventually consolidating into the community that would become Sparta. The Dorians were not merely conquerors, they were a people who brought with them a martial culture. They subdued the local populations, the Achaeans and other pre-Dorian groups, reducing many to the status of helots, or state-owned serfs. This subjugation was the foundation of Spartan society, a ruling warrior class supported by a laboring majority that produced food and resources. Formation of the Spartan state. Sparta was not originally a single city, but rather a collection of villages along the Eurotas River. Over time, these villages united into one political entity, forming what historians call the Polis of Sparta. This unification gave Sparta a stronger base of power than many other Greek city-states, which often remained fragmented. What truly set Sparta apart, however, was its system of governance. Sparta developed a unique form of dual kingship, with two royal families, the Aegiads and the Eurypontids, sharing power. This unusual arrangement likely arose from the early need to balance authority among different ruling clans. The dual kingship also ensured that Sparta always had a king available to lead its armies in war, while the other could remain at home to govern. Alongside the kings, Sparta developed one of the earliest examples of a mixed constitution. The Gerousia, a council of elders, and the Apella, an assembly of Spartan citizens, balanced the king's power.
Later, the ephors, 5 annually elected officials, emerged as some of the most powerful figures in Spartan politics. This layered structure helped prevent tyranny and allowed Sparta to focus its energies on maintaining internal stability. A society shaped by fear. While geography and politics were important, the defining characteristic of Sparta was its social system. At the core of this system was a constant fear, the fear of the Helot population. The Helots outnumbered their Spartan masters. They worked the land, harvested crops, and provided the resources that allowed Spartans to devote themselves entirely to military training. But their numbers made them a constant threat. Uprisings were frequent, and the Spartan ruling class lived in perpetual anxiety of rebellion. To maintain control, Spartans created a society where every citizen was first and foremost a soldier. It was this need for security that drove Sparta to develop its notorious militarized lifestyle. The entire structure of society was designed to ensure that Spartan warriors were the most disciplined, the most fearsome, and the most loyal in all Greece. The Spartan lifestyle begins in childhood. Unlike Athens, where boys could pursue education in philosophy, art, and politics, Spartans' children were raised for one purpose: war. This process began almost at birth. When a child was born, Spartan elders inspected the infant. If the baby was weak or deformed, it was often abandoned, a harsh practice meant to ensure only the strongest would survive. At the age of 7, boys were taken from their families and entered the Agoge, the Spartan training system. This was not simply military education, it was an all-encompassing way of life. Boys were taught endurance, obedience, and survival. They lived in barracks, endured harsh discipline, and were encouraged to steal food to learn cunning, yet punished severely if caught, teaching them the value of both resourcefulness and secrecy. Through the Agoge, boys were transformed into warriors who valued the collective above the individual. Loyalty to the state came before family, personal desires, or even life itself.
When a boy in Sparta reached the age of 7, his life took a dramatic and irreversible turn. Childhood, as most cultures knew it, simply did not exist in this society. Play, family warmth, and softness were luxuries reserved for other parts of Greece. In Sparta, a boy's 7th birthday was the signal that he no longer belonged fully to his family. He now belonged to the state. He was taken from the household and placed into the Agoge, the state-sponsored education and training system that was the heart of Spartan power. This program was designed to strip him of softness and shape him into an unyielding soldier, ready to serve the needs of Sparta above all else. The Agoge was not just a school, it was a crucible. It was designed to break boys down physically and mentally, and then rebuild them into warriors whose loyalty to Sparta was absolute. The system created a bond stronger than blood, for every boy grew up shoulder to shoulder with those who would one day stand beside him in battle. These were not just comrades. They became brothers forged by hardship. Life in the Agoge began with brutal adjustments. Boys were given simple tunics and forced to sleep on beds of reeds that they themselves had to collect without tools. Blankets were not provided. Instead, they learned to endure cold nights. They were underfed on purpose, given meager rations that were never enough to satisfy their hunger. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was training. Spartan leaders wanted the boys to learn how to steal food, but to do it with cunning. If caught, the boy was punished severely, not for stealing, but for failing to do it without detection. This lesson emphasized survival skills and cleverness, qualities considered as important as strength.
From dawn until night, boys were put through rigorous drills. They learned how to run barefoot over rocky terrain, how to wrestle, and how to handle weapons even before their bodies were fully grown. Endurance mattered more than comfort. If a boy cried out from pain, he was ridiculed. If he showed fear, he was shamed. The expectation was that Spartan boys must grow into men who felt no fear, who never showed weakness, and who valued obedience above all else. Teachers, often older veterans, did not spare the rod. Whipping was a normal part of discipline, not just as punishment, but as training and enduring pain. Boys were expected to stand silent, even as lashes cut their backs. Endurance of suffering became a badge of honor. To cry out in pain was disgraceful. To stand firm was to prove one's worth as a future Spartan warrior. The Agoge was also about instilling absolute loyalty. Boys were grouped into units where they lived, trained, ate, and slept together. They developed a collective identity. They were reminded constantly that they did not exist as individuals, but as part of the Spartan state. Their worth was measured not by personal ambition, but by how well they served the whole. By the time they were in their teens, Spartan boys were already hardened, disciplined, and fearless in a way unmatched by any other Greek society. The brutality extended beyond physical hardship. Boys were trained in mental sharpness and cunning. They were encouraged to answer questions briefly and sharply, giving rise to the term laconic speech, named for Laconia, the region of Sparta. Long speeches and flowery words were despised. The Spartans valued wit, brevity, and action. To waste words was to waste time. This discipline of the mind reflected the broader Spartan way of life: efficient, practical, ruthless. Survival tests were another infamous part of the Agoge. Boys were often left alone in the wilderness with minimal supplies, forced to survive through their wits and endurance. They had to learn to navigate rugged landscapes, hunt for food, and protect themselves against natural dangers and rival groups. These ordeals instilled a sense of independence, but also constant reliance on their Spartan training. The training lasted for years. By the age of 18, boys had been hardened into soldiers ready for battle. They joined the ranks of young warriors, but were not considered full citizens until they proved themselves further in combat and in loyalty to the state. Those who passed all tests would eventually become part of the Spartan elite, the hoplites, who fought in the famous phalanx formation that made Sparta's army nearly unstoppable. Yet in this harsh system, one unique feature set Sparta apart from most ancient cultures: the role of its women. While men endured the Agoge, women also had a form of training, though very different in nature. Spartan girls were not confined to homes like in Athens. Instead, they were encouraged to be physically strong, to run, to wrestle, and to train their bodies. The reasoning was simple. Strong women would give birth to strong sons. Mothers were seen as vital contributors to Spartans' military strength, not passive figures. Spartan women were educated, at least in basic literacy, and were given far more freedoms than women in other Greek city-states. They could own and manage property, which was unheard of elsewhere in Greece. While men were often away at war, women took charge of estates and households. This gave them a level of authority unmatched in the Greek world. Their voices mattered in the functioning of Spartan society, even if politics officially remained in the hands of men. The influence of Spartan women was also moral and cultural. Mothers famously urged their sons with the saying, "Come back with your shield or on it." It was an unflinching reminder that cowardice was unacceptable. A son who returned without his shield meaning he had thrown it away to flee, would face dishonor worse than death. Women were expected to raise sons and husbands who embodied Spartan ideals, and they played their part fiercely. Marriage in Sparta was unusual too. Young men often married in secret during their military service. Husbands would sometimes visit their wives secretly at night until they had completed their full duties to the state. This reinforced the idea that marriage and family life existed to serve Sparta, not the other way around. Love and personal life were secondary to the needs of the state. The combination of male Agoge training and the powerful role of women created a society unlike any other. Every Spartan, man or woman, was shaped by the state's relentless pursuit of military supremacy. Boys were molded into fearless warriors, and women were empowered to uphold and reproduce those values. The system was harsh, unforgiving, and even brutal, but it produced results. Sparta became one of the most formidable military powers in history, feared and respected across the Greek world. The Agoge was the very engine of this power. It ensured that from the youngest age, Spartans were taught to endure, to obey, to fight, and to place Sparta above all else. In a world where most Greek city-states prized philosophy, art, and politics, Sparta had chosen a different path. It was a society built for war, maintained by discipline, and defined by sacrifice.
The story of Sparta cannot be told without its great rival, Athens. These two city-states were not just geographical neighbors on the Greek mainland. They represented two entirely different visions of life, politics, and power. Where Athens valued democracy, philosophy, and art, Sparta built its world on military strength, obedience, and order. Their rivalry would eventually drag much of Greece into decades of war, and their cooperation against Persia would create some of the most legendary battles in history. The roots of rivalry. By the 5th century BCE, Athens and Sparta had become the two most powerful city-states in Greece. Athens controlled a vast naval empire through the Delian League, a coalition of city-states that paid tribute to Athens in exchange for protection. This gave Athens enormous wealth and influence, which they invested into magnificent temples like the Parthenon, and into advancing philosophy, theater, and democratic governance. Sparta, by contrast, remained landlocked and suspicious of outside influence. Its power rested on its army, an unmatched professional fighting force made up of the hoplites, citizen soldiers trained since childhood to fight in perfect formation. Unlike Athens, Sparta avoided empire building through trade and colonization. Instead, it kept its strength by enforcing control over the Helots, the enslaved population that farmed the land and supported the Spartan military machine. The two city-states shared the same Greek religion, language, and culture, but their values could not have been more different. For Athens, freedom of speech and debate were the pillars of society. For Sparta, obedience and silence were considered virtues. As both grew stronger, their differences turned into open rivalry. The Persian Wars and Spartan heroism. Before turning against each other, Athens and Sparta first fought side by side against a common enemy, Persia. In 490 BCE, the Persian Empire, under King Darius I, attempted to invade Greece. The Athenians, with limited help from their allies, won a stunning victory at Marathon. But the Persians would return with a much larger force under King Xerxes in 480 BCE. The Persians crossed into Greece with what ancient writers described as hundreds of thousands of soldiers, though modern historians suggest the numbers were likely smaller.
Against this threat, the Greeks formed an uneasy alliance led by Sparta. The most famous battle of this war was Thermopylae, where Sparta's king Leonidas and his 300 warriors made their stand. At the narrow pass of Thermopylae, the Spartans, along with a few thousand Greek allies, held off the massive Persian army for 3 days. The Spartan hoplites fought in their legendary phalanx formation, shields locked together, spears thrust forward, creating an unbreakable wall of bronze and wood. Their discipline and training allowed them to kill countless Persian soldiers despite being outnumbered. Eventually, betrayal led the Persians to find a hidden path around the pass, surrounding the Spartans. Realizing the battle was lost, Leonidas dismissed most of the Greek allies and remained with his 300 Spartans and a small number of Thespians who refused to leave. They fought to the last man. Though defeated, their sacrifice became a symbol of courage and resistance that inspired the Greeks to continue the war. The battles that followed, particularly the naval clash at Salamis, led by Athens, and the final victory at Plataea, in which the Spartans played a decisive role, drove the Persians back and secured Greek independence. Yet even in victory, the seeds of conflict between Athens and Sparta were already being sown. Athens and Sparta after Persia. After the Persian Wars, Athens entered its golden age. Under leaders like Pericles, Athens expanded its naval power, strengthened the Delian League, and transformed it into an empire. The wealth collected from its allies funded the construction of temples, theaters, and schools of philosophy. Athens became the intellectual and cultural heart of Greece, producing figures like Socrates, Herodotus, and Sophocles. Sparta, however, looked on this rise with suspicion. Unlike Athens, it did not welcome cultural change or expansion through trade or colonization. Sparta feared that Athenian influence would spread into the Peloponnesus and threaten its way of life. Athens, meanwhile, saw Sparta as a rigid and oppressive power, too harsh to be the leader of Greece. The rivalry escalated as both powers tried to expand their influence over other city-states. Allies were forced to choose between the Delian League, dominated by Athens, and the Peloponnesian League, led by Sparta. Inevitably, war broke out. The Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BCE, was one of the longest and bloodiest conflicts of the ancient Greek world. It pitted Sparta's disciplined military against Athenian democracy and naval supremacy. In the early stages of the war, Athens relied on its fleet to strike Spartan allies along the coast while hiding behind the long walls of the city. Sparta, lacking a strong navy, could do little to break Athens' defenses. But then disaster struck from within. A plague spread through the crowded city, killing tens of thousands of people, including Pericles. This weakened Athens at a crucial moment. Even so, the war dragged on for decades, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Sparta eventually adapted, building a navy with the financial support of Persia, the very empire both had once fought to repel. With this new naval power, Sparta cut off Athenian trade routes and blockaded the city. In 404 BCE, Athens finally surrendered. Its walls were torn down and its empire dissolved. Discipline versus democracy. The Peloponnesian War showed the clash of two worldviews. Sparta's disciplined, militarized society ultimately triumphed on the battlefield, but its victory came at a cost. Athens' democracy, though defeated, had left behind a cultural legacy of philosophy, drama, and political thought that outlasted Sparta's military dominance. Sparta's victory did not bring peace or stability to Greece. Instead, constant warfare continued among the city-states. Sparta itself would decline within a century, weakened by rigid traditions, a declining population of citizens, and the resentment of the Helots. When Macedonia, under King Philip II, and later Alexander the Great, rose to power, Sparta played only a minor role in the new order of Greece. Conclusion. The rivalry between Sparta and Athens defined much of Greek history. Together, they fought heroically against Persia, with the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae becoming a timeless symbol of sacrifice. But their differences, discipline versus democracy, order versus freedom, made it impossible for them to remain allies. The Peloponnesian War revealed the strengths and weaknesses of both societies. In the end, neither truly won. Sparta's discipline gave it temporary dominance, but Athens' ideas would echo across the centuries, shaping the future of Western civilization. The story of their conflict is not just about war, but about two competing visions of how human beings should live and govern themselves.
Sparta's story did not end with its military glory. After centuries of dominance, the Spartan system began to weaken. Their rigid lifestyle, which had once given them unmatched strength, gradually became the very reason for their decline. By the 4th century BCE, Sparta was no longer the unstoppable power it had been during the Persian and Peloponnesian Wars. One of the main reasons for Sparta's decline was its rigid population structure. Spartan citizens, known as Spartiates, were a very small group compared to the Helots, enslaved farmers, and the Perioikoi, free but non-citizen traders and craftsmen. Because Spartan men were expected to devote their lives to military service and training, they did not focus on expanding their population or economy. As wars and battles continued, the number of full Spartan citizens decreased dramatically. By the Hellenistic period, there were only a few hundred true Spartans left to defend the city-state. Another problem was their resistance to change. Athens and other Greek city-states were experimenting with new political systems, trade, and cultural growth. Sparta, on the other hand, remained tied to its old militaristic values. While this gave them discipline, it also left them behind in diplomacy, innovation, and long-term stability. Their over-reliance on Helots made them vulnerable, as constant uprisings threatened their society from within. Maintaining control over such a large enslaved population drained Sparta's energy and resources. The turning point came after their brief dominance following the Peloponnesian War. Sparta had defeated Athens, but the victory was short-lived. Their harsh rule over other Greek states made them deeply unpopular, and soon new alliances formed against them. In 371 BCE, the Battle of Leuctra changed everything. The Theban general Epaminondas defeated the Spartan army in open battle, something that had once seemed impossible. This shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility. From that point onward, Sparta would never again be the supreme power of Greece. During the rise of Macedon under Philip II and his son Alexander the Great, Sparta stood aside. Unlike Athens or Thebes, they did not play a major role in Alexander's campaigns. Their society had become too rigid and too small to compete with the new military powers of the era. In the following centuries, Sparta was reduced to a secondary role in Greek politics, admired for its past, but no longer feared as a dominant force. And yet, despite its political and military decline, the idea of Sparta lived on. Ancient writers like Xenophon and Plutarch preserved the stories of Spartan discipline, courage, and sacrifice. The tale of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae became a lasting symbol of bravery against overwhelming odds. Even though their actual system collapsed, their reputation as the ultimate warrior society survived for generations.
This legacy shaped the way later civilizations thought about military strength. In Rome, for example, admiration for Spartan discipline influenced aspects of the Roman army. The Romans valued strict training, unity, and the willingness to sacrifice for the state, qualities often compared to Sparta. Later, during the Renaissance, European thinkers looked back at Sparta as a model of simplicity and toughness, in contrast to the luxury and corruption of other societies. In the modern era, the word Spartan has taken on a meaning far beyond ancient Greece. It is used to describe a lifestyle of discipline, simplicity, and endurance. Military academies around the world have drawn inspiration from the Spartan model, emphasizing rigorous training and unity. The phrase, "come back with your shield or on it," is still remembered as the ultimate symbol of loyalty and sacrifice. Sports teams, military units, and even fitness programs today proudly use the name Spartan to represent toughness. Movies and literature have made the Spartans cultural icons, presenting them as warriors who lived without fear and placed honor above life. While modern portrayals often exaggerate or romanticize Spartan life, they reflect the enduring fascination with this society. At the same time, historians remind us that the Spartan system was far from perfect. It relied heavily on slavery, it denied citizens freedom of thought and creativity, and it left little room for personal choice. In many ways, it was a harsh and unforgiving society. But the fascination comes from the fact that for a time, it worked. In a world of competing city-states, Sparta stood out as a place where every citizen was shaped to serve the state as a warrior. The decline of Sparta teaches an important lesson. No system, no matter how strong, can last forever if it cannot adapt. Their discipline gave them power, but their inability to evolve eventually brought their downfall. Yet the legend of Sparta outlived the city itself. Today, when people speak of being Spartan, they mean being strong, disciplined, and willing to endure hardship. This shows that while the city-state itself has long vanished, its cultural impact continues to inspire people across the world. From battlefields to sports arenas, from military training grounds to everyday life, the spirit of Sparta remains a symbol of endurance and simplicity.